My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'll never forget the moment my fiancé's mother grabbed the microphone at our wedding rehearsal dinner and announced that I wasn't good enough for her son. The crystal chandeliers of the Harbor Grand Ballroom seemed to dim as Eleanor Montgomery's perfectly manicured hand wrapped around that microphone, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light like a weapon. What she didn't know was that in exactly 7 days, I'd be standing in a different ballroom, wearing a different dress, marrying a man who saw me as an equal partner rather than a decorative accessory. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the girl who thought love meant shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's vision of perfection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I was the daughter of 2 incredibly hard-working immigrants who had built their life from absolutely nothing. My father, Daniel Hayes, had arrived from Ireland with $200 in his pocket and a degree in engineering that nobody in America seemed to recognize. My mother, Lynn Shen Hayes, had left Taiwan with even less, carrying only her talent for numbers and an unshakable determination to create opportunities her daughter would never have to fight for. They met at a community college where both were taking remedial English classes despite being fluent in multiple languages. Their accents had marked them as outsiders, but their work ethic marked them as unstoppable. Our home was a modest ranch house in southeast Portland, nothing like the waterfront properties or West Hills mansions where my future in-laws would eventually reside. But what our house lacked in square footage, it made up for in warmth and the constant smell of my mother's cooking. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm during the day and took freelance clients at night, her calculator clicking away at our kitchen table long after I'd gone to bed. My father had eventually found work as a draftsman at a mid-sized engineering firm, not the position his education had prepared him for, but one he approached with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything in his life. Education was the religion in our household. My parents believed with absolute conviction that academic excellence was the pathway to a life where their daughter wouldn't have to prove herself twice as hard for half the recognition. They saved every spare penny for my college fund, declining vacations and new cars and anything that wasn't strictly necessary. I understood from a young age that their sacrifices came with expectations, but they were expectations born from love rather than control. They wanted me to have choices they'd never had, opportunities they'd been denied. I threw myself into academics with the same intensity my parents brought to their work. Throughout high school, I maintained a perfect grade point average while participating in debate team, student government, and volunteering at the local community center where I tutored recent immigrant children in English. The story I told myself was that I was driven by personal ambition, but looking back, I recognized I was also trying to justify my parents' sacrifices. Every scholarship, every academic award, every teacher's praise felt like validation that their struggles had been worthwhile. My acceptance to the University of Washington's business program came with a full academic scholarship that made my mother cry with relief and pride. The scholarship covered tuition, and my parents insisted on helping with living expenses despite my protests. I moved to Seattle at 18, determined to make the most of the opportunity that had been built on the foundation of my parents' relentless work. The university felt enormous compared to my high school, filled with students who carried themselves with the casual confidence that comes from never having to question whether you belong. It was during my sophomore year that I met Christopher Montgomery at a university networking event. He was finishing his MBA at the same institution, tall and classically handsome with dark hair that always seemed perfectly styled and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He wore expensive suits even to casual events and spoke about business with the easy authority of someone who'd grown up around boardroom discussions. When he approached me at the reception following a guest lecture on corporate finance, I was flattered that someone so polished and established would notice a sophomore undergraduate still finding her footing. Christopher was charming in a way I'd never experienced before. He asked thoughtful questions about my studies, remembered details from our conversations, and treated me with a respectful attention that felt both exciting and validating. Our early dates were at restaurants I'd never have chosen for myself, places with wine lists thicker than textbooks and servers who treated Christopher with the deference reserved for regular high-spending customers. He insisted on paying for everything, waving away my attempts to contribute with a gentle firmness that I initially interpreted as generosity rather than control. What I didn't fully understand then was that Christopher and I came from fundamentally different worlds. His family owned Montgomery Development Corporation, one of the largest commercial real estate development firms in the Pacific Northwest. His childhood home was a sprawling estate in Medina with views of Lake Washington, the kind of property that appeared in architectural magazines. He'd attended exclusive private schools where networking happened on lacrosse fields and at fundraising galas. His path had been smoothed by family connections, legacy admissions, and the invisible safety net that comes with generational wealth. But in those early months of dating, these differences felt romantic rather than problematic. Christopher introduced me to a world of gallery openings and charity events, weekend trips to wine country and private boxes at symphony performances. I was Cinderella at the ball, dazzled by the glamour and attention. He seemed fascinated by what he called my work ethic and authenticity, qualities that in retrospect he probably viewed as charmingly exotic rather than truly valuable. I represented something different from the women in his usual social circle, daughters of his parents' friends who'd grown up in the same privileged bubble. Meeting Christopher's family should have been my first clear warning sign, but I was too infatuated to recognize the red flags. His mother, Eleanor Montgomery, was a woman who'd married into wealth and guarded it with the ferocity of someone who understood it could disappear. She was impeccably dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage, her blonde hair maintained at enormous expense to hide any evidence of her actual age. The first time Christopher brought me to his family's home for dinner, she looked at me the way a gemologist might examine a questionable diamond, searching for flaws and finding plenty. The evening had been a masterclass in subtle hostility. Eleanor asked questions about my background with the kind of polite interest that barely concealed her judgment. Where exactly in Portland was I from? What did my parents do? Had I grown up attending country clubs or participating in any particular social organizations? Each question was designed to establish that I didn't belong in their world, that my background was fundamentally incompatible with the Montgomery legacy. Christopher's father, Richard Montgomery, was less overtly hostile but equally dismissive, barely acknowledging my presence beyond a brief handshake before returning to his phone and work emails. Christopher noticed the tension but brushed it off with reassurances that his mother just needed time to warm up to anyone new. He framed her coldness as protective instinct rather than class prejudice, making excuses for behavior that should have made me reconsider the entire relationship. But I was 20 years old and convinced that love could overcome any obstacle. I believed that if I just proved myself worthy, if I worked hard enough and achieved enough, his family would eventually accept me. It was the same logic I'd applied to every other challenge in my life, the immigrant daughter's mentality that effort and excellence could earn you a place at any table. As our relationship progressed through my junior and senior years, I molded myself to fit Christopher's world in ways both obvious and subtle. I changed how I dressed, trading my practical student wardrobe for more expensive pieces that looked appropriate for the restaurants and events he frequented. I learned which wines to order, which artists were currently fashionable to discuss, and how to make small talk at charity functions where the ticket price exceeded my monthly food budget. I became fluent in the social codes of his circle while growing increasingly distant from my own background and the values my parents had instilled. My parents, to their credit, expressed concerns about the relationship though they tried to be supportive. My mother noticed how I changed when Christopher was around, how my voice became softer and my opinions more carefully modulated. My father worried about the imbalance he perceived, the way Christopher's family wealth created a dynamic where I was always trying to prove myself worthy rather than being valued for who I already was. But when you're 22 and convinced you've found your soulmate, parental warnings sound like outdated caution rather than hard-earned wisdom. After graduation, I accepted a position as a junior analyst at a respected investment firm in Seattle. The job was competitive and demanding, requiring the kind of long hours and intense focus that had always energized me. I was good at the work, quickly earning recognition from senior partners for my analytical skills and attention to detail. My career was beginning to take off in ways that should have been exciting, but Christopher had opinions about my professional trajectory that didn't align with my ambitions. He suggested I consider less demanding positions, roles that would allow more flexibility for the social obligations that came with being a Montgomery. He talked about the importance of being available for family events and charity commitments, responsibilities that in his worldview took precedence over professional achievement. When I mentioned wanting to pursue an MBA or move into more senior analytical roles, he'd change the subject or make comments about how corporate ambition wasn't particularly attractive in women. These weren't ultimatums but gentle redirections, the kind of subtle discouragement that accumulates over time until you've unconsciously limited your own possibilities. The proposal came during a weekend trip to Victoria, a romantic getaway that Christopher had planned with his characteristic attention to detail. He'd arranged everything: the boutique hotel overlooking the harbor, reservations at an exclusive restaurant, even coordinating with the staff to have champagne waiting in our room. When he got down on one knee at a scenic overlook as the sun set over the water, I said yes without hesitation. The ring was spectacular, a family heirloom featuring a diamond that had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through generations of Montgomery women who had presumably navigated the same social waters I was now entering. The engagement period should have been joyful but instead became a slow erosion of my autonomy disguised as wedding planning. Eleanor immediately took control of every detail, dismissing my preferences with practiced efficiency. The venue I suggested wasn't prestigious enough. The flowers I liked were too common. The guest list I proposed included far too many of my family's friends and not nearly enough of the Montgomerys' important business contacts. Each decision became a battle I usually lost, worn down by Eleanor's insistence and Christopher's unwillingness to support my choices when they conflicted with his mother's vision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My own mother tried to participate in the planning but was systematically excluded from meaningful decisions. Eleanor made it clear through 1,000 small gestures that my family's input wasn't valued or necessary. When my mother suggested incorporating some traditional elements from her Taiwanese heritage, Eleanor dismissed the idea with a condescending smile and comments about maintaining the wedding's cohesive aesthetic. I watched my mother's face fall and said nothing, too conflict-averse to defend the very traditions that had shaped my upbringing. The wedding budget ballooned to absurd proportions, all funded by the Montgomerys with the unstated expectation that their financial contribution entitled them to complete control. The dress Eleanor selected for me cost more than my first year of college tuition and looked like something designed for a bride half my age, all princess silhouette and excessive embellishment. When I tried to suggest alternatives, Eleanor reminded me that Montgomery brides had certain standards to uphold, that our wedding would be featured in society pages and needed to reflect appropriate elegance. My role in my own wedding had been reduced to showing up and looking appropriate, a realization that should have terrified me but instead produced a numb acceptance. I told myself this was temporary, that once we were married and settled I could reclaim my independence and build the equal partnership I'd always imagined. Christopher assured me his mother would back off once we were officially family, that this controlling behavior was just her way of ensuring everything was perfect for her only son's wedding. The wedding rehearsal was scheduled for a Friday evening, exactly 1 week before the ceremony. The Harbor Grand Ballroom where the reception would take place had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with thousands of dollars worth of flowers that would be discarded after a single evening. The rehearsal dinner itself was almost as elaborate as many people's actual weddings, with a seated meal for 80 guests and a string quartet providing background music. I wore a dress Eleanor had selected, cream-colored silk that felt more like a costume than something I'd have chosen for myself. My parents sat at a table with my aunt and uncle, looking uncomfortable in the formal setting despite their best efforts to appear at ease. My father had worn his best suit, the one he saved for truly special occasions, and my mother had chosen an elegant navy dress that Eleanor had somehow still managed to make a dismissive comment about earlier in the evening. I could see them trying to make conversation with the other guests at their table, Christopher's business school friends and their accomplished partners who spoke in casual references to ski trips and summer homes. The dinner proceeded according to Eleanor's meticulously planned schedule. Toasts were made by Christopher's father and his best man, both filled with inside jokes about golf tournaments and business deals that meant nothing to half the room. When it came time for my father to speak, he stood with quiet dignity and offered simple, heartfelt words about welcoming Christopher into our family and wishing us both happiness. His slight accent, barely noticeable to me after a lifetime of hearing it, seemed more pronounced in the formal setting. I saw Eleanor exchange a look with one of her friends, a microscopic expression of disdain that probably went unnoticed by everyone except me. As dessert was being served, Eleanor rose from her seat at the head table and reached for the microphone the toastmaster had been using. Christopher's father looked surprised. Clearly this wasn't part of the planned program, but Eleanor smiled with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding any room she entered. The conversation in the ballroom gradually quieted as people realized she intended to speak. What happened next unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare where you're watching yourself from outside your own body, powerless to intervene. Eleanor began her speech with apparent warmth, talking about Christopher's childhood and her dreams for his future. She spoke about Montgomery family values, the importance of maintaining certain standards, and the responsibility that came with their family name. Her tone was gracious, almost motherly, which made what came next even more devastating. Then her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She looked directly at me, her smile still in place but her eyes cold with calculation. She talked about how she'd tried to welcome me into their family despite our obvious differences in background. She mentioned, with apparent concern, that she'd noticed how uncomfortable I seemed at their social events, how I didn't quite understand their world or the obligations that came with being a Montgomery wife. Her words were delivered with such polished cruelty that they could almost be mistaken for genuine worry rather than deliberate humiliation. The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. I could feel every eye turning toward me as Eleanor continued, her voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics. She expressed doubts about whether someone from my background could truly adapt to the lifestyle her son deserved. She questioned whether I understood what it meant to be part of their family, to uphold their reputation and support Christopher's position in society. Each word was chosen with precision, designed to wound while maintaining the veneer of maternal protection. I sat frozen, my face burning with humiliation as Eleanor essentially announced to everyone present that I wasn't good enough for her son. My parents' expressions shifted from confusion to horror as they understood what was happening. My mother reached across the table as if to comfort me, but we were too far apart. Christopher sat beside me, and I turned to him desperately, waiting for him to stand up and defend me, to tell his mother her behavior was unacceptable. Instead, he looked down at his plate, his jaw tight but his mouth firmly closed. His silence was somehow worse than his mother's words. Eleanor concluded her speech by saying that while she'd hoped for the best, she couldn't in good conscience stand by and watch her son make what she believed was a terrible mistake. She suggested, with false gentleness, that perhaps we needed to reconsider whether this wedding should proceed. The implication was clear: I was being given an opportunity to gracefully exit, to save face by calling off the wedding myself rather than forcing her to take more drastic action. The silence that followed her speech was absolutely crushing. Then someone, I never discovered who, began a slow, awkward applause that a few other guests joined half-heartedly before it died away entirely. I stood up from my seat, my legs shaking but my mind suddenly crystal clear. Every eye in the room watched as I carefully removed the engagement ring from my finger and placed it on the table in front of Christopher. His head snapped up, genuine surprise finally breaking through his passive demeanor. Without saying a word, I walked out of that ballroom with as much dignity as I could summon. I heard my mother calling my name, heard chairs scraping as my parents presumably stood to follow me, but I kept walking. I made it through the hotel lobby, past the concerned looks of staff members who'd clearly heard commotion from the ballroom, and out into the cool Seattle evening. Only then, standing on the sidewalk as taxis and rideshares passed by, did I allow myself to fully feel the crushing weight of what had just happened. My mother reached me first, pulling me into her arms with the fierce protectiveness I remembered from childhood. My father stood beside us, his hand on my shoulder, radiating a quiet fury I'd rarely seen from him. They didn't say "I told you so" or lecture me about the relationship they'd worried about from the beginning. They simply held me as I finally allowed myself to cry, mourning not just the relationship that had ended but the version of myself I'd compromised away trying to fit into a world that had never wanted me. We went back to my apartment that night, my parents staying over in my small one-bedroom place, my mother making tea while my father sat in concerned silence. The next morning, I woke to find messages from Christopher, not apologizing for his silence or his mother's cruelty, but asking me to reconsider and not make rash decisions based on one difficult evening. The messages revealed everything I needed to know about our relationship. He viewed his mother's public humiliation of me as a difficult evening, something to be smoothed over rather than the deal-breaker it absolutely was. I blocked his number and social media accounts, refusing to engage with what I knew would be attempts to manipulate me back into compliance. My parents returned to Portland after extracting a promise that I'd come visit soon. My mother hugged me tightly before leaving, whispering in Mandarin that I deserved someone who would fight for me, not someone who'd sit silently while I was torn apart. My father simply said he was proud of me for walking away, that it took more strength than staying would have required. The weekend after the rehearsal dinner disaster, I called in sick to work, unable to face the office where several colleagues had been invited to the now-cancelled wedding. I spent Saturday in my apartment, alternating between crying and feeling a strange, giddy relief. The life I'd been building with Christopher had required constantly editing myself, minimizing my ambitions and background to fit into his family's narrow definition of acceptable. Walking away felt like removing shoes that had been too tight for too long. Sunday morning, I forced myself to go for a run along the waterfront, needing to move and think and process everything that had happened. The Seattle skyline glittered in the early light, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number as I was cooling down on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay. The message was from someone named Adrian Park, asking if I'd be willing to meet for coffee to discuss a potential opportunity. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam or a recruitment pitch I wasn't in the mood to entertain. But something about the professional tone and the mention that she'd heard about my work through colleagues at my firm made me curious. I replied cautiously, agreeing to meet the following Tuesday at a cafe near my office. What I didn't know was that this chance encounter would completely alter the trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined while sitting on that bench, still processing the wreckage of my failed engagement. Adrian Park turned out to be nothing like I expected. When I arrived at the cafe that Tuesday morning, I spotted her immediately at a corner table, a woman in her late 40s with sharp intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of success without ostentation, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun that emphasized the elegant bone structure of her face. She stood to greet me with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than performative. We ordered coffee and she got straight to the point with a directness I found refreshing after months of navigating the Montgomery family's passive-aggressive communication style. She explained that she was the chief operating officer of Park Ventures, a private equity firm specializing in sustainable technology investments. The firm had been founded by her brother, Julian Park, and had grown rapidly over the past decade to become one of the most respected investment firms in the sector. They were looking for someone with strong analytical skills and a fresh perspective to join their team as a senior analyst, a position that would involve evaluating potential investments and working directly with portfolio companies. The opportunity she described was significantly more advanced than my current role, with responsibilities that would challenge me in exactly the ways I'd been craving. But what struck me most was how Adrian spoke about the firm's culture. She emphasized collaboration over hierarchy, results over pedigree, and innovation over tradition. She talked about building a team of people who brought diverse perspectives and weren't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. It sounded almost too good to be true, especially given the timing. I asked her the obvious question. How had she found me and why was she reaching out now? Adrian smiled slightly and explained that one of the senior partners at my current firm had mentioned my work during a casual conversation at an industry event. He'd spoken highly of my analytical abilities and mentioned in passing that I was getting married soon. Adrian had made a note to potentially reach out after my wedding when things settled down. Then this past weekend, that same partner had mentioned at another event that my wedding had been called off rather dramatically, and suggested that I might be open to new opportunities. The idea that my public humiliation had somehow led to this conversation should have bothered me, but instead I felt a strange sense of fate. If Eleanor Montgomery hadn't sabotaged my wedding rehearsal, I'd be spending this week finalizing details for a marriage that would have slowly suffocated my ambitions. Instead, I was sitting across from a woman offering me the kind of professional opportunity I'd stopped allowing myself to even want. We talked for over an hour about the role, the firm's investment philosophy, and the kind of projects I'd be working on. Adrian asked insightful questions about my analytical approach and seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on various market trends. She didn't ask anything about my personal life or the cancelled wedding, maintaining a professional boundary that I deeply appreciated. As we were wrapping up, she mentioned that if I was interested, she'd like me to meet with her brother Julian for a more formal interview later that week. I accepted immediately, feeling a spark of excitement I hadn't experienced in months. We scheduled the interview for Thursday afternoon at Park Ventures offices in downtown Seattle. As I walked back to my own office, I felt something shifting inside me. The humiliation of the rehearsal dinner was beginning to transform into something else, a catalyst that had freed me from a future I'd been too committed to question. The next 2 days passed in a blur of anticipation and nervous preparation. I researched Park Ventures extensively, studying their investment portfolio and reading every interview Julian Park had given. What I discovered impressed me deeply. Julian had built his firm on a foundation of identifying undervalued sustainable technology companies and providing not just capital but strategic guidance to help them scale. He had a reputation for being brilliant but demanding, someone who expected excellence but rewarded it generously. Several articles mentioned his unconventional background. He dropped out of a PhD program in environmental engineering to start his first company, which he'd sold for a substantial sum before founding Park Ventures. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Seattle beautiful, all golden light and cool breezes. I dressed carefully in my best interview suit, a navy ensemble I'd purchased for my own money rather than something Eleanor had selected. The symbolism felt important. I was showing up as myself rather than the person I'd been trying to become for Christopher's family. Park Ventures offices occupied the top 3 floors of a modern building with sweeping views of Puget Sound. The reception area was decorated with minimalist elegance, featuring photographs of wind farms and solar installations from their portfolio companies. A young receptionist greeted me warmly and offered coffee while I waited, mentioning that Mr. Park was just finishing up another meeting. I'd barely taken my first sip of coffee when the elevator doors opened and a man emerged who made my breath catch in my throat for reasons that had nothing to do with nervousness about the interview. Julian Park was probably in his mid-30s, tall and lean with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it and sharp features that might have seemed severe except for the intelligence and energy that animated his expression. He wore dark jeans and a fitted button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, projecting an air of someone too focused on actual work to worry about corporate formality. He spotted me immediately and crossed the reception area with quick, purposeful strides. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm and his dark eyes met mine with an intensity that was somehow both professional and unsettling. He apologized for running a few minutes late, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place, and gestured for me to follow him to his office. Julian's office was surprisingly understated for someone who ran a firm managing billions in assets. The space was dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the water and mountains beyond. His desk was covered with reports and what looked like engineering schematics, and one wall featured a large whiteboard filled with equations and diagrams. Everything about the space suggested someone whose mind was constantly working, analyzing, connecting patterns that others might miss. He offered me a seat in one of the comfortable chairs arranged near the windows rather than across his desk, a subtle choice that shifted the dynamic from interrogation to conversation. For the next 90 minutes, we talked about everything from market trends in renewable energy to the analytical frameworks I used for evaluating investment opportunities. Julian asked questions that challenged my thinking and listened with complete attention when I answered. He shared his perspective on deals they were currently evaluating, inviting me to weigh in with my own analysis. What struck me most was how he engaged with my ideas. When I suggested an alternative approach to evaluating one potential investment, he didn't dismiss it or explain why his method was superior. Instead, he leaned forward with genuine interest and asked me to walk him through my reasoning. We ended up in a spirited debate about risk assessment methodologies that felt more like collaboration than interview. His mind worked with a speed and creativity that was exhilarating to keep up with. At some point during our conversation, the sun began to set over the Sound, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Julian glanced at his watch and looked surprised by how much time had passed. He asked if I had other commitments that evening, and when I said I didn't, he suggested we continue our discussion over dinner. He knew a small Korean restaurant nearby that had excellent food and quiet booths where we could keep talking. I should have recognized this as unusual, that a formal interview extending into dinner was crossing some kind of professional boundary. But the conversation had been so engaging, and Julian's interest in my perspective seemed so genuinely intellectual rather than personal, that I agreed without hesitation. We took his car, a sleek electric vehicle from one of Park Ventures' portfolio companies, and drove to a restaurant in a neighborhood I'd never explored. The restaurant was small and unpretentious, with exactly the kind of authentic atmosphere that couldn't be manufactured. Julian was clearly a regular, the owner greeting him in Korean with obvious affection. We were shown to a booth in the back where the lighting was soft and the noise from other diners provided just enough privacy for conversation. Julian ordered several dishes without looking at the menu, checking with me about dietary restrictions but otherwise taking charge with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly what was good. As we ate, our conversation shifted from purely professional topics to more personal territory. Julian asked about my background, and I found myself telling him about my parents' immigration story and the values they'd instilled in me. He listened with the same focused attention he'd brought to our earlier discussion of investment strategies, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely interested rather than just being polite. He shared his own story in return. His parents had immigrated from South Korea when he was young, his father a chemist and his mother a mathematics professor. They'd faced many of the same challenges my parents had encountered, the credential recognition issues and subtle discrimination that immigrants navigate in building new lives. He'd grown up watching them work twice as hard for half the recognition, and that experience had shaped his approach to building Park Ventures. He wanted to create something that valued merit and innovation over pedigree and connections. There was something magnetic about Julian when he talked about his work. His passion for sustainable technology wasn't abstract or performative. It came from a genuine belief that capital could be deployed to solve meaningful problems. He spoke about climate change and energy transition with the urgency of someone who understood the stakes, and about the companies in their portfolio with the pride of someone invested in their success beyond just financial returns. I found myself drawn to his vision in ways that went beyond professional admiration. Here was someone who'd built something significant without compromising his values or playing by rules he didn't believe in. He'd created success on his own terms, surrounding himself with people who shared his commitment to doing work that mattered. It was everything the Montgomery world wasn't: substance over style, mission over status, genuine achievement over inherited position. As dinner wound down, Julian circled back to the job opportunity. He said with characteristic directness that he wanted to offer me the position, that our conversation had confirmed what Adrian had seen in my work. The role would come with a significant salary increase and equity in the firm, but more importantly, it would give me the chance to work on investments that could genuinely impact climate and sustainability challenges. He wanted someone who could think independently and wasn't afraid to challenge his assumptions, and he believed I was that person. I accepted on the spot, probably breaking every rule about negotiating offers and taking time to consider. But the opportunity felt right in a way that Christopher's proposal never had. This was someone seeing my potential and offering me room to grow into it, rather than asking me to shrink myself to fit predetermined expectations. We shook hands across the table, and Julian smiled with genuine warmth that transformed his intense features into something unexpectedly approachable. He drove me back to my apartment, and we continued talking during the drive about logistics and start dates. I'd need to give notice at my current firm, probably 2 weeks, and he wanted me to start as soon as possible after that. As he pulled up in front of my building, he turned to me with an expression that seemed almost hesitant, unusual for someone who radiated such confidence in professional settings. He said he hoped this wasn't inappropriate, but he wanted me to know that he found our conversation tonight remarkable. Not just professionally stimulating but personally energizing in ways that had surprised him. He clarified quickly that he wasn't suggesting anything that would compromise our working relationship, but he wanted to be honest about the impression I'd made. There was something about the way I thought, the questions I asked, the perspective I brought that he found genuinely captivating. I should have been alarmed by this admission from my new boss, should have recognized the potential complications of starting a job with this kind of personal interest already declared. But instead I felt a thrill of recognition, because I'd felt the same magnetic pull during our hours of conversation. I told him honestly that I felt the same way, that talking with him had been intellectually exhilarating in ways I hadn't experienced before. We looked at each other in the dim interior of his car, the air thick with possibility and awareness. Julian broke the moment first, saying with visible effort that we should probably maintain appropriate boundaries given that we'd be working together. I agreed, though part of me wanted to throw caution aside and see where this electricity might lead. We said goodnight with professional politeness that didn't quite match the charged energy between us, and I watched his car pull away before heading into my building. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange mixture of endings and beginnings. I gave notice at my current firm, where my departure was met with congratulations from colleagues who'd heard about the Park Ventures opportunity. Several people mentioned they'd always thought I was capable of more than my current role allowed, comments that made me wonder how much I'd been limiting myself without realizing it. I tied up loose ends on my projects and prepared comprehensive handover notes, determined to leave on the best possible terms. During this transition period, I also had to deal with the aftermath of my cancelled wedding. Christopher called repeatedly until I finally answered and told him with absolute clarity that we were done, that his silence during his mother's speech had shown me everything I needed to know about our future together. He tried to argue that I was overreacting, that we could work through this if I'd just be reasonable. His inability to see why his mother's behavior and his complicity were deal-breakers confirmed I'd made the right decision. Eleanor Montgomery apparently told everyone who would listen that I'd had a breakdown and called off the wedding, painting herself as the concerned almost mother-in-law worried about her son's near miss with an unstable gold digger. The gossip reached me through mutual acquaintances, but I found I didn't care about controlling the narrative. The people whose opinions mattered knew the truth, and everyone else was welcome to believe whatever version made them comfortable. My parents called frequently during this period, checking on my emotional state and celebrating my new job opportunity. My mother said something that stuck with me during one of these calls. She told me in Mandarin that sometimes what feels like the worst thing that could happen is actually the universe clearing space for something better. The humiliation at the rehearsal dinner had felt devastating in the moment, but it had freed me to pursue opportunities I'd been too committed to notice. My first day at Park Ventures arrived with the crisp energy of early November. I wore a dress I'd chosen myself, professional but reflecting my own style rather than Eleanor's vision of appropriate. Adrian met me in the lobby and spent the morning introducing me to the team, a diverse group of brilliant people who welcomed me with genuine warmth. My office was smaller than Julian's but still had impressive views, and my desk came equipped with the latest technology and access to research databases I'd only dreamed about in my previous role. Julian himself was in London for meetings with a potential portfolio company, a detail I told myself I wasn't disappointed about. Adrian explained that he traveled frequently for due diligence on investments, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. She walked me through my initial projects, several companies in various stages of evaluation that needed deep financial analysis. The work was challenging and engaging, requiring exactly the kind of rigorous thinking I'd always enjoyed. I threw myself into the job with intensity, working long hours because the projects genuinely fascinated me rather than out of obligation. The team dynamic was everything Adrian had promised, collaborative and intellectually generous. We had regular meetings where everyone was expected to contribute ideas and challenge each other's assumptions. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like my perspective was valued not despite my relative youth and different background but because of the fresh thinking it brought. Julian returned from London after my first week, and we had a brief check-in meeting where he asked how I was settling in. The professional boundaries we'd agreed to maintain were firmly in place. Our conversation focused entirely on my projects and initial impressions of the firm. But I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, or how the energy in the room shifted when we were alone together. We were both carefully pretending that the connection from our dinner conversation didn't exist, but the effort required to maintain that pretense was itself revealing. Over the next several weeks, we fell into a pattern of professional interaction that was scrupulously appropriate and completely charged with unspoken awareness. Julian would ask my opinion in team meetings and listen with that focused intensity I'd experienced during our interview. We'd debate investment strategies with the kind of intellectual engagement that was professionally valuable and personally thrilling. He challenged my analysis and expected me to defend my positions with data and logic, treating me as an equal rather than a junior team member. The rest of the team seemed oblivious to the undercurrent between us, or perhaps they were too professional to acknowledge what they might have noticed. Adrian occasionally gave me thoughtful looks that suggested she saw more than we were revealing, but she never said anything direct. The work itself was demanding enough that I could usually focus on spreadsheets and models rather than dwelling on the attraction I was trying to ignore. Then came the evening that changed everything, about 6 weeks after I'd started at Park Ventures. We were in the final stages of evaluating a major investment in a battery technology company, and several of us were working late to finish the analysis before a board presentation the next morning. Around 8 o'clock, people began leaving one by one until eventually just Julian and I remained, hunched over financial models in the conference room. We worked in concentrated silence for a while, the city lights of Seattle twinkling below us and coffee growing cold in paper cups. At some point Julian stood to stretch, rolling his shoulders and walking to the windows. He stared out at the view for a long moment before speaking without turning around. He said he needed to tell me something, and he hoped I wouldn't take it the wrong way given our professional relationship. I set down my pen and waited, my heart suddenly beating faster. Julian turned to face me and said with that characteristic directness that working with me these past weeks had been both the best and most difficult experience of his professional life. The best because my analytical mind and fresh perspective had genuinely improved their investment decisions. The most difficult because maintaining appropriate boundaries was becoming harder every day when what he really wanted was to know me beyond the confines of conference rooms and financial models. He acknowledged this was completely inappropriate, that as my boss he had a responsibility to maintain professional distance. But he also said he'd built his career on being honest about what he wanted and going after it with full commitment. He wanted to take me to dinner again, not to discuss investment strategies but simply to spend time together. He wanted to know what made me laugh and what I dreamed about and all the things that had nothing to do with work. And he wanted me to know that if I felt even a fraction of the same pull he did, he was willing to figure out how to navigate the professional complications. I should have said this was a terrible idea. I should have reminded him about workplace policies and power dynamics and all the very good reasons why bosses shouldn't pursue romantic relationships with employees. Instead, I found myself crossing the conference room to stand in front of him, looking up into dark eyes that held both uncertainty and hope. I told him I felt exactly what he described, that these weeks of professional interaction had been exquisite torture because I wanted so much more than our carefully maintained boundaries allowed. I said that Christopher had taught me what it felt like to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort, and Julian made me feel like I could expand into my full potential. That the way he challenged my thinking and valued my perspective was more attractive than any romantic gesture Christopher had ever made. Julian reached out slowly, giving me time to step back if I wanted to, and cupped my face in his hands with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of his usual energy. He said he wanted to be absolutely clear about one thing. If we did this, if we explored what was building between us, it would never require me to compromise my professional growth. He would never ask me to be less than I was capable of becoming. And if at any point the personal relationship conflicted with my career advancement, he'd step back without hesitation because my potential mattered more than his desire. The kiss when it came was inevitable and electric, months of suppressed attraction finally finding expression. We broke apart after a moment that felt both endless and too brief, and Julian rested his forehead against mine while we both caught our breath. He suggested with a slightly shaky laugh that perhaps we should finish the financial models and table this discussion until we weren't in the office. We somehow managed to complete the analysis, though my concentration was shot and I had to redo several calculations. Around 11, we called it done and began packing up our materials. As we rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Julian asked if I'd ever been to the San Juan Islands. When I said I hadn't, he mentioned he had a house on one of the smaller islands, a place he went when he needed to think without distractions. He wondered if I'd like to spend the weekend there, away from the office and the city and all the reasons we'd been telling ourselves this was complicated. I knew accepting meant crossing a line we couldn't uncross. I knew it would change our professional dynamic in ways I couldn't fully predict. But I also knew that this connection with Julian was something rare and worth exploring, that the alternative was spending years wondering what might have been. So I said yes, and we made plans for him to pick me up early Saturday morning. The weekend at Julian's island house fundamentally shifted everything between us. The small cedar-shingled cottage sat perched on a rocky outcrop with panoramic views of the water and distant mountains. We spent Saturday morning walking the deserted beaches, talking about everything from childhood memories to our dreams for the future. By afternoon, the careful professional distance we'd maintained for weeks had completely dissolved, replaced by an ease and intimacy that felt simultaneously new and deeply familiar. Julian cooked dinner that evening, revealing yet another unexpected facet of himself as he prepared Korean dishes his mother had taught him. We sat at a weathered wooden table on the deck, wrapped in blankets against the November chill, watching the sun set over the water in brilliant shades of orange and purple. He told me about buying this property 5 years earlier, how he'd needed a place away from the constant demands of the business world where he could think clearly and remember why he'd started Park Ventures in the first place. I shared things with him that night I'd never told Christopher in 3 years together. I talked about the subtle ways I'd changed myself during my relationship with the Montgomerys, how I'd stopped mentioning my parents' immigrant background in certain social situations, how I'd learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny and pretend interest in conversations that bored me senseless. I described the exhaustion of constantly monitoring myself, editing my natural responses to fit expectations I could never quite meet. Julian listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as I detailed 1,000 small ways I'd been diminished. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. He said something I've never forgotten, that the most attractive thing about me wasn't my analytical skills or my education or any of the surface qualities people usually praise. It was my authenticity when I allowed myself to show it, the passionate intensity one brought to things I cared about, the way my whole face transformed when I talked about ideas that excited me. He said watching me come alive during our interview had been like seeing someone step out of shadow into sunlight, and he wanted to spend his life making sure I never felt the need to retreat into shadow again. We made love that night with a tenderness and passion that felt like both discovery and homecoming. Afterwards, lying tangled together while listening to waves crash against the rocks below, Julian traced patterns on my shoulder and asked me to tell him about my dreams. Not the professional ambitions I'd already shared, but the private hopes I kept to myself. I found myself confessing things I'd barely acknowledged to myself. How I wanted to eventually start a foundation focused on helping immigrant families navigate educational and financial systems, how I dreamed of mentoring young women from backgrounds like mine, how I hoped to prove that success didn't require abandoning the values and communities you came from. Julian was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then he told me about his own closely held dream, one he hadn't shared widely because it felt almost impossibly ambitious. He wanted to transform Park Ventures from a successful firm into something that could genuinely accelerate the transition to sustainable energy on a global scale. He envisioned not just funding companies but creating an entire ecosystem of support that would help breakthrough technologies reach market faster. He talked about legacy and impact, about building something that would matter long after he was gone. What struck me most about that conversation was how our dreams complemented rather than competed with each other. Christopher had always viewed my professional ambitions as obstacles to the life he'd planned, inconveniences to be managed and eventually redirected. Julian saw my goals as integral to who I was, pieces of a larger vision that aligned with his own values. We stayed up most of the night talking, mapping out futures both individual and shared, discovering the ways our separate paths could strengthen each other. Sunday morning dawned gray and misty, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that makes you want to stay in bed with good coffee and better company. We did exactly that, taking our time with breakfast and conversation before reluctantly acknowledging that we needed to return to Seattle and the real world. As I packed my bag, I felt a strange mixture of contentment and anxiety. This weekend had been perfect, a bubble outside normal life, but I worried about how things would shift once we were back in the office navigating the complexities of our professional and personal relationship. Julian seemed to read my thoughts as we loaded the car. He said we needed to have a practical conversation about how to handle our relationship at work. He acknowledged that as my boss, the power dynamic created legitimate concerns about consent and fairness that couldn't be ignored just because we were both adults who wanted this. He'd been thinking about solutions, ways to structure things that would protect both my professional standing and our personal connection. The conversation that followed during the ferry ride back to the mainland was intensely pragmatic, almost clinical in how we dissected the potential complications. Julian suggested I consider transitioning from employee to partner. Park Ventures was structured as a partnership rather than a traditional corporation, and my work over the past weeks had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and analytical capability he looked for in partners. As an equity partner rather than employee, the power dynamic that complicated our personal relationship would be fundamentally different. I wouldn't report to him directly, and my compensation would be tied to the firm's performance rather than his evaluation of my work. I listened carefully, recognizing this wasn't some romantic gesture but a serious professional proposal. Julian walked me through the economics, explaining how partnership equity worked and what kind of stake he thought was appropriate given my contributions. The numbers were significant, life-changing in ways that had nothing to do with our personal relationship. He also acknowledged the optics, that some people might assume I was being given partnership because we were involved rather than on merit. He wanted me to think carefully about whether I was comfortable with that perception, even though everyone who worked with us would know the truth of my capabilities. The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Partnership at a firm like Park Ventures was something I'd imagined might be possible in 5 or 10 years with sustained excellence and luck. Julian was offering it now, barely 3 months into my tenure, because he believed I'd already demonstrated the value. But accepting would mean fully committing to this path, to Julian, to a future that was still new and uncertain. I told him I needed time to think about it, to consider all the implications beyond the immediate appeal. We spent the drive back to Seattle discussing the practical details, the legal structure and equity percentages and vesting schedules. By the time Julian dropped me at my apartment, my head was spinning with possibility and concern. He kissed me goodbye and reminded me there was no pressure, that I should take whatever time I needed to make the right decision for myself. The fact that he was willing to wait, that he prioritized my comfort and certainty over his own desires, told me more about his character than any romantic declaration could have. That evening, I called my parents and laid out the entire situation. My mother listened silently as I explained about Julian, about the weekend, about the partnership offer. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. She said in Mandarin that she'd been worried when I'd started seeing my new boss so quickly after Christopher, concerned I might be rebounding into another problematic relationship. But hearing me talk about Julian, about how he challenged and supported me simultaneously, she could hear a confidence in my voice that had been missing during the Montgomery years. My father got on the phone and asked the practical questions I'd expected. What were the terms of the partnership? Was there independent legal counsel reviewing the documents? How would conflicts of interest be managed? When I answered each concern with the thoroughness Julian and I had already discussed, my father made a satisfied sound. He said the offer seemed fair and well-structured, that Julian had clearly thought through the potential complications. Then he surprised me by adding that sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as risks, and the only real mistake would be letting fear prevent me from pursuing something that could be extraordinary. Armed with my parents' perspective, I spent the next week doing my own due diligence. I consulted with a lawyer friend from college who specialized in partnership agreements, asking her to review the proposed terms objectively. She came back impressed, noting that the equity stake was generous but not suspiciously so, and that the vesting schedule and governance structure protected both parties fairly. I also had honest conversations with Adrienne, asking her directly whether she thought I was ready for partnership or if Julian's judgment was clouded by personal feelings. Adrienne invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant where we could talk candidly. She told me she'd been expecting this conversation and had already prepared her thoughts. She said that when Julian first mentioned the partnership idea, her initial reaction had been concern that he was moving too fast, letting his obvious feelings for me override his usually excellent judgment about talent. So she'd gone back and reviewed all my work from the past 3 months with a critical eye, looking for any signs that Julian had been giving me easier assignments or grading me on a curve. What she'd found instead was work that consistently exceeded expectations. The battery technology analysis I'd led had identified risks that the rest of the team had missed, ultimately saving them from a problematic investment. My financial modeling was more sophisticated than some partners who'd been with the firm for years. Most importantly, I asked questions that challenged their assumptions in productive ways, bringing a perspective that strengthened their decision-making. Adrienne said she would have recommended me for junior partner track within a year regardless of my relationship with Julian. His offer was early but not unearned. Her endorsement meant everything, coming from someone with no personal stake in whether Julian and I worked out romantically. I asked her directly about the optics, whether she thought other people at the firm would assume I'd slept my way into partnership. Adrienne smiled slightly and said that people who wanted to be cynical would always find reasons for cynicism, but anyone who'd actually worked with me would know better. She also pointed out that as a woman in business, I'd face unfair assumptions regardless. Better to deal with them from a position of actual power and equity than to spend years trying to prove myself worthy of opportunities that should already be mine. With Adrienne's support and my parents' blessing, I spent the weekend reviewing the partnership documents one final time. Everything was structured to protect both my interests and the firm's, with clear governance provisions and fair economic terms. On Monday morning, I walked into Julian's office and told him I was ready to accept the partnership offer. The smile that broke across his face was pure joy, uncomplicated by any of the careful control he usually maintained in professional settings. The formal partnership papers were drawn up over the following weeks, reviewed by independent attorneys to ensure everything was above board and fair. The rest of the team was informed of my new role, and while I noticed a few raised eyebrows, the overall reaction was positive. My colleagues had worked closely enough with me to understand I'd earned the promotion through actual contributions rather than personal connections. Several people congratulated me warmly, noting they'd been impressed by my work and thought the partnership was well-deserved. The transition from employee to partner shifted my relationship with Julian in subtle but significant ways. We were now true colleagues, making decisions together rather than him directing my work. Our relationship dynamic became more balanced, the power differential that had concerned us largely eliminated by my equity stake and governance role. We still kept our romantic relationship private at work, maintaining professional boundaries in the office, but knowing we were building something together as equals rather than boss and subordinate made everything feel more solid and sustainable. December arrived with the kind of cold rain that defines Seattle winters. The firm was busy with year-end activities, closing out investments and preparing for the next year's fund. I threw myself into the work with renewed energy, my partnership status giving me access to deals and decisions I'd only observed from the periphery before. Julian and I developed a rhythm of working together, our different thinking styles complementing each other in ways that strengthened the firm's investment process. 3 months after my catastrophic wedding rehearsal, I attended a different kind of celebration. Park Ventures was hosting a holiday party at an elegant downtown venue, one of those glass-walled spaces with views of Elliott Bay and the city lights. I'd invited my parents to fly up from Portland for the occasion, wanting them to see the life I was building and meet the people who'd become important to me. My mother wore a beautiful silk dress she'd bought for my cancelled wedding, repurposing it for a celebration that actually reflected who I was rather than who I was trying to become. Watching my parents at the party filled me with a complicated pride. My father talked engineering with the CEO of one of our solar technology portfolio companies, his expertise finally valued in a context where immigrant credentials weren't automatically dismissed. My mother charmed everyone she met, her natural warmth and intelligence shining through without any of the social anxiety I'd witnessed at Montgomery family events where she'd felt judged and found wanting. Adrian spent 20 minutes in animated conversation with my mother about raising daughters with ambition, and I could see genuine connection forming between them. Julian found me on the terrace where I'd stepped out for air, overwhelmed by the contrast between this celebration and the rehearsal dinner that had ended so badly. He handed me a glass of champagne and joined me at the railing, both of us looking out at the Seattle skyline glittering in the cold night. He asked if I was okay, noting that I seemed emotional. I told him honestly that I was thinking about how different my life looked now compared to 3 months ago, how the worst night of my life had somehow led to the best things. Julian was quiet for a moment, then said he had something important to tell me. He'd remembered that it was exactly 1 week since my original wedding date, the wedding to Christopher that would have happened if Eleanor Montgomery hadn't inadvertently set me free. I'd actually forgotten, too consumed with the life I was building to dwell on the one I'd escaped. Julian said he wanted me to know something, and his voice carried an intensity that made me turn to face him fully. He told me that even though we'd only been together a few months, he'd never been more certain of anything than he was of us. He understood if I needed time given everything I'd been through, and he wasn't proposing or pressuring me toward any particular timeline. But he wanted me to know his intentions were serious and permanent. He saw a future with me that excited him more than any business success ever had. He imagined building a life together where we challenged each other intellectually, supported each other's dreams, and created something meaningful both professionally and personally. Julian said he'd watched me transform over these months, not into someone different but into a fuller version of who I'd always been. He'd seen me confident and fierce in negotiations, tender and thoughtful with portfolio company founders who needed guidance, brilliant in the analytical work that drove investment decisions. Every facet of me made him more certain that I was someone he wanted beside him for life, as partner in every sense of the word. I kissed him right there on the terrace, not caring who might see through the glass walls, overwhelmed by the rightness of everything he was saying. I told him I was already certain too, that what we had felt nothing like my relationship with Christopher. This was partnership rather than performance, collaboration rather than compliance. I didn't need more time to know that building a life with him was what I wanted, though I agreed we should let things unfold naturally without rushing toward predetermined milestones. We stood there together in the cold, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the city lights reflect off the dark water. Through the windows behind us, I could see my parents laughing with Adrian, see my colleagues celebrating a successful year, see the life I'd built from the ashes of the one that had fallen apart. The humiliation of that rehearsal dinner felt like it had happened to a different person, someone who'd been so focused on external validation that she'd lost sight of what actually mattered. The party continued late into the evening, and as I moved through the crowd making conversation and accepting congratulations on my partnership, I felt a bone-deep satisfaction I'd never experienced at Montgomery family events. This was success on my own terms, built through my own abilities, surrounded by people who valued me for who I actually was. When someone mentioned they'd heard about my cancelled wedding earlier in the year and hoped I was doing better, I smiled genuinely and said it had worked out perfectly. Sometimes the universe has to clear away what's wrong before you can find what's right. As winter deepened into spring, Julian and I continued building our relationship with the same thoughtful intention we brought to investment decisions. We traveled together to visit portfolio companies, blending work trips with personal exploration. I met his extended family, who welcomed me warmly and without any of the class consciousness that had poisoned my experience with the Montgomerys. His mother, in particular, embraced me with genuine affection, telling me stories about Julian's childhood and thanking me for making her son happier than she'd seen him in years. We talked seriously about the future we wanted to create together. Both of us valued the work we were doing at Park Ventures, but we also dreamed of expanding our impact beyond the firm. I began developing plans for the foundation I'd mentioned that first night on the island, an organization that would provide mentorship and financial literacy education to immigrant families. Julian supported the project enthusiastically, offering both funding and strategic guidance while making clear this was my vision to shape. 6 months after that holiday party, on a perfect June morning, Julian and I stood in a small ceremony on his island. The cottage had been transformed with simple elegant decorations, wildflowers from the property arranged in mason jars and string lights wrapped around the deck railing. We'd invited only our closest friends and family, wanting the day to be about the commitments we were making rather than impressing anyone with elaborate displays. My parents stood proudly in the front row, my mother dabbing at happy tears while my father beamed with genuine approval. Adrian served as my witness, having become both mentor and dear friend over the past months. Julian's family filled the other side, their warm enthusiasm such a stark contrast to the cold judgment I'd experienced from Christopher's family. The ceremony was officiated by a friend of Julian's, a former professor who'd encouraged his entrepreneurial ambitions when everyone else thought he was crazy to leave academia. The vows we exchanged were ones we'd written ourselves, spending weeks crafting words that captured what we meant to each other. Julian promised to always challenge me to grow while accepting exactly who I was, to value my ambitions as much as his own, to build a partnership of equals where both our dreams had space to flourish. I promised to bring my full authentic self to our relationship, to never diminish my own light to make someone else comfortable, to meet his intensity with my own and build something extraordinary together. As we exchanged rings, I thought briefly about the wedding that never happened, the one that would have been all wrong despite looking perfect on paper. That ceremony would have been held in a grand ballroom with hundreds of guests I barely knew, wearing a dress chosen by someone else, making vows that emphasized obedience and support rather than partnership and equality. Eleanor Montgomery's cruelty at that rehearsal dinner had felt like the worst thing that could happen, but it had actually been a gift. It had forced me to choose myself, to walk away from a life that required constant self-diminishment, and in doing so had cleared the path to something infinitely better. The reception was held at a local restaurant that served fresh seafood and had a deck overlooking the water. Everything about the celebration felt authentic and joyful, from the locally sourced menu to the mixture of colleagues and family who'd shaped both our lives. During the toasts, Adrian told the story of how she'd first reached out to me, timing that she now considered remarkably fortuitous. She joked that Park Ventures had gotten an excellent partner out of the arrangement, even if she'd had to deal with Julian being insufferably happy ever since. My father spoke briefly about watching his daughter find someone who saw her strength as an asset rather than a threat, who encouraged her ambitions rather than trying to contain them. He said something in Mandarin that he then translated, about how the best partnerships are built when two people each bring their whole selves and create something greater than either could alone. Julian's toast was characteristically direct, saying he'd built his career on identifying undervalued opportunities, and marrying me was the best investment decision he'd ever made. Later, as we danced under string lights with the sound of waves in the background and our friends celebrating around us, Julian asked if I had any regrets about how things had unfolded. I thought about the question seriously, considering the humiliation and pain of that rehearsal dinner against everything that had come after. The public rejection had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying. It had shown me exactly what I'd been accepting, the diminishment I'd been willing to tolerate, the future I'd been resigned to. Without that moment of crisis, I might have gone through with the wedding, spent years trying to earn approval from people who would never value me, slowly lost myself trying to fit into a role that was never meant for me. I told Julian honestly that I regretted the time I'd wasted trying to fit into a world that didn't value me, but I couldn't regret the journey that had led me here. Sometimes the universe has to break you free from the wrong path before you can find the right one. That rehearsal dinner had been the moment the universe pushed me off a cliff, and I discovered in the falling that I had wings. Everything that had happened since, the job at Park Ventures, the partnership, falling in love with someone who saw me clearly and valued what he saw, all of it had only been possible because I'd been forced to choose myself first. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, my mother pulled me aside for a private moment. She held my hands and looked at me with an expression that held both pride and relief. She said she'd been so worried during my relationship with Christopher, watching me shrink and dim, but had felt powerless to intervene because she thought it was what I wanted. Seeing me now, fully myself and radiant with confidence and joy, she felt like she had her daughter back. She told me in Mandarin that the best revenge against people who underestimate you is living well and fully, becoming so successful and happy that their judgment becomes irrelevant. A year later, Park Ventures announced a major new fund focused on sustainable technology, with me named as one of the lead partners. The business press covered the story, profiles appearing in industry publications and mainstream media. Several articles mentioned my marriage to Julian Park, and one journalist did enough research to discover I'd been previously engaged to someone from a prominent Seattle family before that wedding was called off. The article didn't go into details, but it included a quote from me about how sometimes what seems like failure is actually redirection towards something better. I wondered briefly if the news reached the Montgomerys, if Eleanor saw that the woman she deemed not good enough had built something far more substantial than the decorative wife role she'd tried to prevent me from escaping. Part of me hoped she did see it, hoped she understood that her cruelty had ultimately freed me to become someone far more successful than I would have been as Christopher's diminished wife. But mostly I didn't think about them at all. I was too busy working with brilliant colleagues on investments that mattered, too occupied with building a life partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, too focused on becoming the fullest version of myself to waste energy on people who'd never understood my worth. The foundation I'd dreamed about became reality that year as well, launching with funding from both Park Ventures and my own partnership earnings. We created programs to help immigrant families navigate educational systems, provided financial literacy training, and offered mentorship to young women from backgrounds like mine. The work was deeply personal and incredibly fulfilling, allowing me to give back to communities that had shaped me while honoring my parents' sacrifices. Julian supported the foundation enthusiastically, serving on the board and helping connect me with resources, but always making clear this was my vision and leadership. On the anniversary of that catastrophic rehearsal dinner, Julian and I were in our home, a beautiful craftsman house we'd purchased together in a neighborhood we both loved. We were cooking dinner together, moving around the kitchen with the easy coordination of people who knew each other's rhythms, when Julian asked if I remembered what day it was. I paused, thinking back, and realized with surprise that it had been exactly 2 years since Eleanor Montgomery had grabbed that microphone and announced I wasn't good enough for her son. I told Julian I'd actually forgotten until he mentioned it, that the anniversary had passed without my noticing. He smiled and said that was probably the best possible sign, that the painful moment had been so thoroughly eclipsed by better things that it no longer haunted me. We toasted to Eleanor Montgomery's cruelty, raising our glasses in ironic gratitude to the woman who'd inadvertently given me the push I needed to change my life. The girl who'd walked out of that rehearsal dinner in tears, humiliated and heartbroken, had discovered something crucial that night. Sometimes the greatest gift is being forced to choose yourself, even when that choice feels like falling. Because that's when you discover you have wings. Eleanor Montgomery had thought she was destroying my future when she publicly rejected me. Instead, she'd freed me to build something far better than anything she could have imagined. For that, I would always be grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.